New announcements are being made quickly in Canada following the election earlier this week. Just this morning, Canada's new Prime Minister announced new details about his upcoming meeting with Trump and what will be on the table. But he also hinted at some major problems in Canada, problems that impact every Canadian citizen, and what he's planning on doing to fix them. However, in order to get every Canadian on board, he started with a message seeking to address the fractures in the country. And I'm not talking about the separatist calls from some of the provinces. And he does so in a Canadian cliche way by making a hockey analogy. Let's start there, then we'll get into the Trump talks and other major concerns.
Canadians in the NHL play for a variety of teams passionately against each other. But when they're in a once-in-a-lifetime series such as the Four Nations or the Olympics, those same Canadians come together to win it all. During elections, Canadians play and cheer for different teams. Now that election is over, and we are in a once-in-a-lifetime crisis. It's time to come together to put on our Team Canada sweaters and win big.
The divisions he's talking about aren't just between left and right, but also between young and old based on polls that show how people voted in the previous election. Canadians 55 years old and up overwhelmingly voted for the Liberals, with the response to the US being their primary concern in the election, while people between the ages of 18 and 34 and 35 and 54, well, they voted more conservative, with affordability and housing concerns chief on their minds. So he encourages these young Canadians who didn't vote for him to get on board and to support the major policies we're going to talk about today. And I would tend to say that regardless of how you voted, you should be hoping that these new policies will actually result in positive outcomes for Canadians who are struggling. Not supporting policies just because they come from a party that you didn't vote for, I think, is silly. But on the flip side, I hope that the Liberal government won't use this as a way to say that any opposition to their policies is anti-Canadian and not pulling the rope in the same direction. Because as I've covered these politics in the past 5 years, I've learned that in many cases, a lack of support for policies doesn't always come from partisanship. Often, all of the parties agree that changes need to be made and agree on the direction, but disagree about the way that these changes are implemented. For example, throughout the election, there was all this talk about the Conservatives not wanting to help seniors because they voted against a bill that would increase the old age security payments. But what wasn't covered as heavily was the way that this increase in security payments only would apply to seniors over the age of 75, essentially splitting them up into two separate classes of seniors. It is this that the Conservatives had a problem with, not the idea of helping seniors. All this to say, Canadians should support policies that are good, not because of what party introduced them, but because of the ideas behind the policies. And similarly, they should be able to be criticized not because of what party introduced it, but instead because of ideas within it that maybe you disagree with. Of course, everything will be impacted by the upcoming negotiations that are set to take place between Donald Trump and Mark Carney in the coming weeks. Now, depending on which news articles you read, though, the framing of this conversation and this meeting will be entirely different. That's why I like to use ground news, because it gives you a better idea of the different ways that different news outlets are reporting on a given story. For example, Politico Europe, which is a left-leaning organization, frames this as Carney taking on Trump in a more adversarial tone, whereas a news outlet like NDTV, which is leaning right, frames this more as Carney wanting a deal, going along with the narrative that Trump's tariffs are bringing people to the negotiation table. Ground news gives you the ability to go even deeper on different sources and checking out their media bias ratings, their factuality ratings, as well as who exactly owns that news source. I do my best to consume media from a whole bunch of different sources, but ground news helps me fill in my blind spots, especially on an international level. I can see how different countries are reporting on stories here at home. And you can subscribe to get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan by scanning the QR code on your screen or by using my link ground.news/Russell. That brings the price down to about $5 per month, or about $8 Canadian. That's ground.news/Russell, or scan the QR code on your screen. And in today's press conference, we heard the exact timing of when this conversation will take place.
On Tuesday, I had a very constructive call with President Trump, and we agreed to meet next Tuesday in Washington. Our focus will be on both immediate trade pressures and the broader future economic and security relationship between our two sovereign nations. My government will fight to get the best deal for Canada. We will take all the time necessary, but not more, in order to do so.
So there will certainly be more to come here, and make sure to subscribe to the channel because we're going to be following every aspect of this. Now, throughout the campaign, Carney said that this 51st state rhetoric would need to stop before negotiation talks could start. Now, based on what a reporter asked him, this seems to be something that he's moving off of.
We've heard Mr. Trump on April 23rd and his surrogates throughout the final days of the campaign reiterate the idea that they believe Canada should become the 51st state. On the campaign trail, you said on multiple occasions that respect for Canada would be one of the key things in terms of having a meeting with him. Do you think over the past few days we have seen respect for Canada from the Trump administration?
Look, it's always important to distinguish want from reality. We're meeting as heads of our government. To discuss that partnership. Now, I'm not pretending those discussions will be easy or they won't proceed in a straight line. There will be zigs and zags, ups and downs. But as I said in my remarks, I will fight for the best deal for Canada and only accept the best deal for Canada and take as much time that's necessary.
This idea of the 51st state seems rather sticky for Trump and members of his administration, so I do think that it's reasonable to talk to him even though this is still kind of going on. The Prime Minister can't just not talk to the President because he doesn't like what's being said. I think it's reasonable to open lines of communication. But regardless of what happens in the talks next week, there are bigger problems at home. We already talked about the split between young and old in Canada, with young Canadians focused more on domestic issues. And in this press conference, Carney signals that affordability is one of his big focuses, chief of which he recognizes is the housing crisis, where he talks about opening up massive funding to tackle this.
We will build houses faster, at lower costs, with a smaller environmental footprint in construction and greater efficiency once families move in. And to kickstart these efforts, we will create a new entity, Build Canada Homes, and provide $25 billion in financing to private developers.
So he pledges to make this massive $25 billion investment, and he's previously said that they're going to up home starts to 500,000 homes a year. And in my eyes, building homes sounds great. However, the devil is in the details. Canadians have a lot of questions about this and want to know how it'll work. Is this social housing that will be built? Does that mean that the houses will be then transferred to provincial or city governments to be managed? Who's going to get access to these homes and how? And to what extent will there be homes built for the purposes of home ownership rather than just housing and social housing for unhoused people or people who are experiencing higher than average market rent? Because solving this crisis is not only building homes, it's not just supply, it's also demand. And when I talk about demand, I'm not just talking about immigration, though we'll talk about that in a moment. I'm also talking about monetary policy. Let me explain. It's very simple. In a lot of Canadians' minds, the only issue in housing is a lack of supply. But more and more so, Canadians are talking about other potential culprits, including this Globe and Mail article that talks about a different issue. They point out what I believe to be one of the major culprits in this issue, and that is monetary policy, or the changing of interest rates and the printing of money by central banks. They talk about how low interest rates contributed to the financialization of Canada's housing stock, with ultra-low interest rates making borrowing inexpensive, encouraging investors to use mortgage leverage for small down payments on additional investment properties. You see, low interest rates as well as printing of money, which Canada did in large form during the pandemic through a program called quantitative easing, well, that risks bringing something called inflation, otherwise known as the growth in costs of goods and services, which is something that went up in Canada by 53% since the year 2005. Central bankers, the people who control these interest rates and programs, will often look at the growth in Canadian wages and say, well, over the long term, it has kind of evened out. But that's not exactly the whole story. They often fail to consider the growth of asset prices or asset price inflation, the growth in price of homes in the stock market. And these numbers are far higher than the wage growth that Canadians have seen over the past 20 years. All this is to say that while I'm all for building on a mass scale, building more homes and embracing new technologies and developing the modular and prefabricated home industries in Canada, I do worry that even if we can build at the extreme scale that Carney is promising, that a failure to address the way monetary policy has encouraged a financialization of the housing stock, as well as the way that it's stoked the growth of the wealth gap, well, I'm worried that that will lead to similar mistakes being made in the future. And it leaves me with the question, in his new role as Prime Minister, will Carney have the fortitude to question the practices of his former group of colleagues, largely central bankers and the managers of behemoth investment funds? I definitely hope so. I hope that he'll be able to shift into this role of Prime Minister and look out for the interests of Canadians instead. Because all the issues we face in Canada are integrated. They affect one another. The issues with home ownership have issues that are downstream from that. Just look at this. It covers the first-time home buyers in Ontario and the average age of them in different years. Now, back in 2014, the median age was 36 of these first-time home buyers. Now, 10 years later, this has risen to an average age of 40, and unfortunately, I don't see this trend slowing down. This has led to tons of Canadians delaying many other life goals that they have until they can own a house, largely family formation and having children. Now, that can be a very big problem for Carney, given one of the other priorities that he's laid out in today's press conference, and that's growing the economy.
We will reinforce our strength here at home by building an economy that creates jobs, grows incomes, and withstands shocks. We will work with provinces, territories, and Indigenous groups to identify projects that are in the national interest, projects that will connect Canada, deepen our ties with the world, and grow our economy for generations.
It's a challenging job, but I wish Carney the best, and I hope that he is successful in growing the economy because we've had a hard time doing so in the past. You see, Canada has been good at growing the economy by growing our worker count, adding more people to the labor pool. As a result, decreasing labor costs, which allows businesses to expand more efficiently, which does grow the economy. Now, this is largely done by policies to get more women into the workforce and increasing immigration. This is largely how we grew the economy over the past 3 years. It allowed government officials to make the very true statement that Canada has had one of the best periods of growth in this window when compared to other advanced economies, but it's largely been because of adding people. Now, we're not so good at growing via innovation, making each individual worker more productive by giving them better tools and better technologies. The Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada said that it's gotten so bad that this has become an emergency.
That's why I want to talk about Canada's long-standing poor record on productivity and convince you just how big of a problem it is. You know those signs that say, in an emergency, break the glass? Well, it's time to break the glass.
And I think Carney understands the importance of this. He talks dramatically about how we're going to transform the economy in his press conference today.
And now that Canadians have honored me with a mandate to bring about big changes quickly, I will work relentlessly to fulfill that trust. Bringing together labor, business, and civil society to advance the nation-building investments that will transform our economy as we embark on the biggest transformation of our economy since the end of the Second World War.
And he says these major changes are going to be made by making massive investments in Canadian businesses to encourage non-government investors and players to make similar investments.
We will use scarce taxpayer dollars to catalyze massive private investment.
And this could potentially be a good idea. I mean, it's true that if a big investment fund sees a commitment from the government to support an industry, that they might see it as less risky to then put their money in that same industry. If the government's going to support it, I have less of a chance of this going bust. But Carney has a big job ahead of him. With a split population, half of which has lost some form of trust in the Liberal government, it will be Carney's job to show Canadians that these investments that he's talking about will be made efficiently and will actually result in the outcomes that he's promising. I hope the businesses that are invested in are fairly selected and not just tied to insiders, because there's a big problem that goes untalked about in Canada. Governments have, in the past, created funds like the Sustainable Development Technology Canada, which invested $2 billion since 2001, as well as the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, which invested $3.4 billion since the year 2017. The ideas and concept behind these funds are good. Invest in new energy solutions and technologies, or invest to make massive infrastructure projects to develop Canada. The idea is good, but in order for that idea to become a reality, you have to have trust in the way that it is executed, and there's a history of it not going so well. The Auditor General of Canada recently reported on this Sustainable Development Fund and how it awarded $59 million to 10 different projects that weren't even eligible for these funds, and those businesses frequently overstated the environmental benefits of its projects. Perhaps you've heard the story of Lion Electric. It's a great example. This is a battery and electric bus producer that the government invested in to the tune of just under $50 million. Now, after that government investment, shareholders and executives reportedly sold their shares in the company after the government sort of pumped them up, and these executives made millions. Now, just a couple of years later, the company filed for bankruptcy, not only evaporating nearly $50 million of public funds that were invested, but also the investments of Canadians who bought these pumped up stocks on the public markets after this government funding, only to see those share values crater to essentially zero. Now, just because this happened in the past doesn't mean that it will happen again. I'm not claiming it will, be it with the Build Canada Homes Fund or with the investments made to bring the fastest changes to our economy since World War II, as Mark Carney stated. I'm simply laying out the challenges that this government and the new Prime Minister will be facing, because they're going to need to provide a new, higher level of transparency that will hopefully reduce the fears of those who are currently skeptical in the Canadian population. So I'm curious what you think about all of this. What do you think of Mark Carney starting these negotiations with Trump next week, even though this 51st state rhetoric is still going on to a certain extent? And what do you think of the new policies when it comes to bringing the country together and bringing those young Canadians into the fold, as well as these new investments in housing and these nation-building projects that will be to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars likely? Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know what I've gotten right and what I've gotten wrong. I'm just an average person trying to figure all this out and putting my thoughts together here on YouTube. And if you want to follow along, click that subscribe button. We're going to be covering all of the events that unfold over the next months. And with any change like this, there certainly will be fast coming changes. So tune in and follow along with me if you'd like to. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.